Hi, my name's Andy Hodgson, and I want to take this next minute to chat to you a little bit about the Emerging Leaders Program and why you should consider it for yourself, for the leaders you're developing, or as a partnership for your church or ministry organisation. You know, before sending out the 12, Jesus says, "The harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Ask the Lord of the harvest, therefore, to send out workers into his harvest field." We still believe this to be the case today, and that's why we want to equip and train disciple-making and movement-building leaders to be sent, so that we may see disciple-making movements launched in all church and community contexts across Australia. The Emerging Leaders Program is an opportunity for leaders to establish their leadership now and to impact their future ministry. Our heart is to equip, train, and launch generations of leaders who think movements like Jesus did, who live authentically as disciple makers in their everyday life, and who are known to be kingdom-minded. We explore the life of Jesus as our model of leadership and lifestyle. By journeying through Jesus' life chronologically, we discover his priorities, his methods, his mission, and his model. And then we work hard to help to implement these priorities in your personal lives and ministries that you lead through coaching, mentoring, and practical application. In addition to this, we recognise the importance of accredited biblical and theological studies. So through our partnership with ACOM, students engage in academic study anywhere from a higher ed diploma through to a master's. We also further explore specific leadership skills for today, and we do this all as a learning cohort. And so we'd like you to consider being a part of any of our programs so that you can be equipped, trained, and launched. So together we can see disciple-making movements through your life and leadership.
Thanks, Andy, I think. All right, I'll give you Andy's done a little bit. For those who don't know me, give you a little bit of background, just so you understand where I'm coming from in terms of what I'm going to talk about today. So I grew up in a family that has a very strong Christian faith and history of following Jesus. Had my own journey through my teenage years, which I'm happy to talk to people about one-on-one. And then in my teens and into my 20s, spent 10 years serving on a beach mission and learnt huge amounts about faith and context and culture and mission in my 10 years there. And since then have worked in a variety of roles in my personal life and in a church context. And about 7 or 8 years ago, my husband and I set up a church plant in our local community out in Bacchus Marsh, out in the west. And we have been on a continual journey of discovery about what that means and how we try to best meet the needs of our very changing and dynamic culture and context that we're in personally, and also in as a broader church in Australia. So we're going to start by looking at a lot of the statistics around the census at the moment. I'm certainly not a statistician or expert in this area, but I think it's really important when we start talking about context to know what our context is. So we're going to look at that on a broad scale. We've just had the census, so we've got a whole heap more data about Australia and some of their demographics and views on religion and Christianity. And so let's start there, and then from there we can start to, break down what that means for us as a society, what it means for us in the church, in the broad context in Australia, and then what that means for us individually in where we are. So so just before we start, I just want to go through couple of little things. So I guess I kind of covered it, that idea of statistics. Why do we care about it? But I think what it really does is it can give us, a picture of where things are at. Now, it's never going to represent everyone. It will depend on where you live as to whether these statistics match or not, which is why we've got to be really careful about how we use the information. We also need to be really careful about what they call not applying causality. So that means not looking at the data and assuming that because a statistic says this, that means that. So, for example, smoking causes an increase in lung cancer. Now we know that that's a causation, but it doesn't mean, so more you see smoking is more prevalent in people with alcoholism, but that doesn't mean that smoking causes alcoholism. It just means there's a correlation there. So we just need to be careful that we're just reading the data as it is and not putting our own interpretation into it. But I think what we really need to focus on is that most important thing, which is what does it mean for you? So what does all this information, all these percentages and statistics mean? What will it mean for you in your personal life and context, and how do you then use it to inform your choices and your actions? So that's what we're going to try to work through today. So, all right. So let's start with population. So Australia's population is 25,422,788 according to the census in 2021. So as you should be able to see the graph, as you can see on the graph, there's been a significant drop, but the total growth is almost directly following overseas migration, and of course that was affected by COVID. So you can see the blue line running through the middle, that's our birth rate. So that's remained fairly steady, it's gone up and down a little bit, but fairly consistent. And you can see the numbers are climbing back up again in terms of immigration. When you look at the breakdown of the immigration of the largest component of overseas people coming in, it's still the UK, but this is followed very closely by India and then China. So we've got, immigration and multiculturalism is a big part of our society, has been for a while, but it is changing in terms of the type of societies that we have immigrating in. So just an important thing to note. So we then also, when you look at the ancestry, so what people list as their ancestry, again, that's changing. So people are 29.9% were listed as Australian, and then the next closest was Chinese at 5.5%. Okay, Indigenous Australians. So Indigenous Australians, the census has really changed in the amount of people identifying. So we've previously, in 2011, you can see there's about 2.5% of the population. It's now up to 3.2%. This increase is largely believed to be because people are feeling more comfortable with identifying with their Indigenous origins. So, and a vast majority of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population is in New South Wales and Queensland. But it's just important to note that that Indigenous Australians are a significant part of our population, and that there are people identifying with their ancestry is increasing. If I'm going too fast, or you have any questions or things you want to raise, please let me know. Okay. All right, Australia's population. So there's been a big shift in the dominant generation in our population. So for a long time, the baby boomers ruled. In fact, even as recently as 2011, they were 25.4% of our population. The next closest was millennials at 20%. And you can see that that's been a big shift. So we're now almost equal with millennials and baby boomers. So the percentage is the same. The numbers are, slightly different, but almost the same. This is a really important thing to be aware of when we start to look at some of the data around church attendance and religious affiliation. Okay, so let's get on to religious affiliation. So more people than ever answered the religious question. It was 93.1% of people who filled in the census answered something on this question, which is it's been an increase. It was 90% in 2016. Okay, so 30% 38.9% of people opted with no religion as their option. That's about 10 million people out of our 25 million in Australia. If you combine all the Christianity denomination options, the total's 43.9%, so Christianity is still higher than the no religion. But if you break it down, it's certainly Catholics the next closest at 20%. So as
you included Catholic in that first 43?
Yes, in that 43.9% Catholics.
Down Catholic and then Christian, it's down to, so Christian is 23.
23.9 it would be, yep, if you take out Catholic. You can see there on the slide that the next closest religions are Islam at 3.2% and Hinduism at 2.7%. So still a lot lower than Christianity. Christianity decreased by more than 1 million people over the last 4 years. So significant drop. Other religions have increased, but that increase is almost correlated directly with migration. So as people from countries where that is the main religion come into our society, then that people who identify with that religious following, that obviously increases to match that. So, all right. Okay, Christian denominations. So we just talked a little bit about this. So Anglican and Catholicism have been and are still the largest Christian denominations in Australia, but it's changed dramatically. So the number of people reporting these denominations has dropped by almost 78%. I think that's over the past, since 2011, so over the past 10 years. So there's nearly all the Christian denominations are declining. The one that has increased is the response that's just Christianity, so not further defined is how they call it on the census, but it's just people not choosing a particular denomination, they're just choosing Christian as their answer.
Denomination, just like, I can't remember what I put out on my phone. So what are the choices again?
I can't give you all of them, but there's obviously Catholic. There would be, I can find it for you, but there would be Catholic, there would be Anglican, there would be Baptist. I don't even know if there's Uniting. There's certainly Presbyterian, there's Protestant, and then there'll be some of the other religions, so Islam, Hindu, Sikh.
There was one for the brethren, though. Well, there was other.
There's other, yep. So you can write other, and then you can choose Christian, not further defined. So, yep. So you can just choose, yes, this Christian that's not linked to a particular denomination.
I don't know. Where would someone like what are those people that put their hands up and wave their arms?
A Pentecostal? I think there was a Pentecostal option.
Was there?
Yep.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
I just couldn't think of the word.
All right. So that was the highest increase. So it was increased, so they're not further defined. That increased by about 75,000 in the last 4 years. So a lot of people are choosing to select that rather than a particular denomination. And that's increased a lot. So it's hard when you look at the numbers, but it's gone from 1% of Australians choosing that to 3% of Australians choosing that. So it has been a marked increase. The only other real denomination that grew was some of the Orthodox ones, so Greek Orthodox, the Coptic Christians. So, and that's again seen they've correlated with migration. So as people from that area move in, then that has increased the amount of people who are identifying as that denomination. Yeah, okay, so religious affiliation. This is just a little bit to show the trends. So as you look at the graph from 1971 right through to 2021, you can see Christianity has been on a decline, and it seems to be on a more rapid decline over the last 10 years. If you can see that last little bit of the graph from 2011 to 2021.
I'm sorry to back in.
No.
The positive looks like we're about to meet the non-Christian side.
Yeah, I know it does. It looks like we're coming together. So the orange line is obviously no religion. People who are choosing no religion, you can see it's almost a direct match in terms of the opposite direction, that it's really spiked over the last 10 years. And then the other religion is the line going across the bottom, and again that slow increase is felt to be related to migration and the multiculturalism of people coming into our area. All right, no religion by age group. So this is where we start to see a little bit of correlation that's really important when we look at population and the no religion selection that people are making on the census. So the two graphs both show the same data, but it's really I find it helpful to look at both because it highlights a couple of different things to me. So when we're looking at the line graph, you can see clearly people in their very early years are higher in terms of their no religion choice, but again their form's going to be filled out by their parents, so that they're probably right up to about 15 to 20 that's going to be influenced by their parents and their choices and religious affiliation. Once we hit around 20, you see a really big step up, and this is no religion, so it increases quite significantly, and then it has a slow decline as you get older, but that 20 to 40 bracket is where it's highest in terms of who is identifying or choosing to select no religion on their census. What's even more apparent when you look at the bar graph is where that's changed over the last 4 years, and you can see that in every age group there has been an increase in the amount of people identifying with no religion. So it's not just in our younger demographic that people are choosing that option, it's across the board. Anyone? I'll just pause there, just make sure there's no questions at this stage. I know I'm running through the data really quickly. We're going to have a chance to try and digest and think through what it is, but at the moment I just really want to give you the facts so you can start to try and process that. Is there any questions or anything? Someone missed something they want me to go back to? Okay, again, the one on the left is showing the same sort of data, but it's interesting to look again at how the pattern moves. So the yellow going through the middle, that's your no religion in terms of the, we're looking now at generational names. So we're looking at the baby boomers and the Gen X and the millennials, then Gen Z and Gen Alpha, which is our current little ones. What I want to highlight here is the comparison with the population data. So what we're seeing here, so the light blue is Christianity, the amount of people identifying as Christian, and that's all the categories of Christianity combined, including Catholics. And you can see that our millennials, which is one of our largest growing populations, is actually the one that identifies the highest with no religion. So where we have the most amount of people, we're getting more and more people identifying as no religion. So it means that gap's getting really wide. Yep. You can see the example, like they've given an example here, so nearly 70% of the interwar generation, so that's 75 years and over, are identifying as Christian, and they're least likely to have no religion. And millennials, 46.5% are identifying as no religion. I like that. All right, so the other data, we're going to have a look at a couple of other things. So the National Church Life Survey has been conducted over a number of years, and that's where they ask churches to fill in a little bit of data, kind of like the census for churches, basically. And they do their statistics aligned with the census, but it doesn't release quite as quickly as the census. So I've got the 2016 data, so just be aware of that the years don't quite correlate. But we can still see some trends happening. So So the age profile for Australian church attendance matches very strongly with the data from the census. So that 15 to 29 years is down at 13%. It pushes right up at that 50 to 69 years. It drops at the 70%, 70 plus years, but I would imagine that's to do with the amount of that population. Yeah, so it's a shrinking population due to people passing away. And you can see on the graph, again clearly, the amount of weekly attendance has dropped significantly since 1991. It is levelling out a little. You can see that in 2016. But again, you can see there's a lot of decline over attendance at church. Yep. And again, yeah, that noticing that the demographic of the amount of people that are attending is much higher than what the population, matching the population, which means there's a wider gap than what is probably being shown in the data in terms of majority of our church attenders are people in the older age group. We've got a much wider gap in the younger age group. So this is looking a little bit at just growth, decline and planting that churches have identified. So you can see there that most churches have declined by about 10%. Other churches have grown by about 10% and about 5% were stable. And only 2% are planting a church or reproducing or multiplying is down at 0.5% in our churches. Again, if you look at the average percentage of newcomers, it's up at 7.2% in a church that's growing, but you need to remember that's only about 10% of our churches in Australia that are identified as growing, and in that, 7.2% of people are newcomers, so are growing in their newcomers. So newcomers will be people who haven't identified as attending church in the last 5 years. So the growth over churches, if it's happening, is happening a little bit in terms of sideways movement. So people moving from one church to another church. In terms of growth happening from new people coming in, it's quite a small proportion. Okay, time to have a little chat about what all this data means for you. So we'll just spend about, let me have a look. We can spend about 10 minutes. Andy, I assume you'll pop some people into some breakout rooms. Just have a chat about, I guess, your response to the data. What do you think some of these numbers mean? I know I've thrown a lot of them at you. But just try and think through which one stood out to you and what you think that means in terms of Australia, what that means for the church, how you interpret that data. Okay, welcome back everyone. All right, totally forgot to tell you to nominate someone to speak on behalf of your group, so feel free to jump in and dob someone in so that you don't have to be the one who does it. Let's start with, I guess, our Zoom buddies. Someone want to jump in? What kind of things did you talk about? What came up? I'm going to dob someone in if you don't. Oh, yay, thanks, Mick.
What did we talk about? It's like, I guess we saw the pattern in our own experience. So the statistics weren't surprising. We've sort of seen that playing out, even in our ministries, because a lot of us we're doing, with youth and stuff. And it's just such a common thing that it's so hard for churches to retain teens and young adults, like that is reflected in the statistics, and that was one thing we were talking about. And another thing was around, I guess, the culture and the cultural influences in terms of everyone having their own truth and everyone being very accepting of other people's views but not taking any of them on board themselves. So it's just sort of, it's interesting to hear about things, but you're not going to let those things impact you, sort of thing. And yeah, sort of what tools do we have left really to influence and to witness to the people around us. There's like hazards and things like that around really equipping the youth that we did have and equipping the young adults that we did have to really know who God is and know what's true, so that they can actually have, discern cultural sort of lies and things that are floating around. So I think that it, guys, was there anything else I missed? Anything I missed? That was us.
Cool. Thank you. Someone else on Zoom want to go? I don't know how many groups there were on Zoom. Andy, how many groups were there?
I'll start copying people in. Anton, Jacob, Tom and Vanessa.
Okay.
Who wants to speak on that group?
Yeah, look, I'd say a few things. I missed a lot of it. Unfortunately, I tuned in a little bit late. Apologies. But it was just really me and Tom were just talking about just our own sort of opinion on what's happening, having a look at that data and seeing that trend and just discussing some of the things, that we think might be happening. And I sort of just said, I think that there was a time when Christendom was a part of our culture. It was cultural Christianity, and so like even my parents, they all had some experience of Sunday school or church, and I think it's been a great shift in that space where it's just not like that now. People aren't exposed to that. Young people grow up and they don't go to Sunday school, and it's not happening. The Lord's Prayer isn't happening in school, and different things like that. So it's just, I think that contributes to it. And yeah, we just talked about the decline in traditionalism and how those sort of traditional churches are, slowly dying, and we need lots of different church plans and different models and methods and practices to be applied, I think, to reach all sorts of different people. I think that was the sum of what we sort of just talked about.
Cool. Thank you. Good reflections. All right. Who else do we need to dob in, Andy?
Edge.
Georgia and Tom.
Yeah. You're going to try and get it remote.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Oh, and that's a good video. So we were just talking about, we were trying to interpret the stats really. We were trying to imagine what, how much of the data what kind of data can't we get from these stats when we think about the actual invisible church and people who aren't as keen to associate with traditional tradition much anymore. And then people who put their name down as Christian might not actually be Christians. So how many people are happy to just tick the box that don't actually really follow the truth?
Yep.
And I think we were also just thinking about, that age between 18 and 29 is like really that prodigal son type season for young people, kind of, I am my own God. There's that journey through finding what does truth look like. And so I'm not surprised to see that age group, at least relative to other age groups, are further from religion all round.
Yep.
Yeah, but we didn't touch too much on the decline, to be honest.
Yep. No, that's great. Thank you. Jump on. If anyone in Zoom, I've missed anyone, just jump in. But we'll go with Lauren and it's Dahlia, isn't it?
Yeah. So similar to what Meg was saying in regards to the young adults, that 20 to 30 or whatever that age group was, it does seem to be a decline in churches. Like there's a lot of focus on kids ministry, youth ministry, and then young adults is where you tend see a drop
Mhm.
in attendance. So we just thought that was really interesting because it correlates. The other thing we were saying was on the census, when parents write for their teens, it would be interesting to get a gauge on youth, especially I guess in our context,
Yep.
to know where they sit with religion. And then the other thought we had was it would be interesting if they did the census again I know they will do it again, but with live streams, like a lot of people have the comfortability to just watch it at home, and then they lose that connection, and then there's that church attendance decline in that too. So it would be interesting to see where that fits over time.
Yep. Yeah, will be interesting to see. Yeah, where things go from here. I think is going to be interesting. Yep. Josh and Stacey, who's going to go?
We talked about stuff. All right, Josh, no way.
Okay. I think one of the things I think first of all, the overall big picture is probably church got complacent in Australia over the years, and we didn't really talk about heaps, but it seems to be a big picture that church has been complacent and church has dropped off and society's changed, the culture's changed in Australia. We recognise locally in our own communities very similar with not a lot of cultural diversity, and that stands out in the community, and then it stands out in the church as well, as we see that. And one thing in our church that is very common, that I see, that is very striking in the statistics nationwide, was the decline in the 90s with 40 to 50 or 60-year-olds, and the impact that's had on their kids now. So people that are young adults now, or like early adulthood, we have a big chunk of like generations missing
Yep.
in our church. Yeah.
Yep. Cool. Lots of great reflections there, and I think really what we're all sort of sharing is there's lots of different elements that are feeding into why this might have dropped, and I think what we need to think about now is what does all this mean for the church in Australia. And while there could be lots of different things that have fed into it, particularly that idea of generational identification. So my grandma was an Anglican, and so my mum was identified as Anglican, and I identify as Anglican even though I have no experience of church. That certainly would be a large proportion probably of that data without, again, I'm trying not to correlate or causate here too much, but what it does show is that as a society, we are changing. We are very close when you combine all of our Christianity data to becoming a minority. If you break it down into the different denominations, we are a minority at this stage. And so that means there's a shift in our culture and our context and our society when a majority of our society, particularly those that are now in significant, when it's hitting those millennials who are in becoming our industry leaders in the next 10 to 20 years, they'll be our politicians. They are the people who are influencing our decisions as to what we focus on as a culture and to the societal structures that we're set up in. So it's while there's lots of reasons why it might be happening, we need to really understand that this is a big societal shift for Australia. It's also a big societal shift for the Western world. So this is not while the rates of change are different in different Western countries. Overall, in Western countries, this is a general trend that's happening. There's some societies, such as Germany and a couple other countries in Europe, that were the dominant countries for Christendom in the past 1700 years, and they're at the point where they're getting church missionaries to come into their countries because their Christianity rate is so low that they actually don't have people there to spread the message of the gospel. So it's not, so we need to be aware that it is, I'm not trying to be, what's the word, pessimistic. I'm trying to just paint the picture that this is a cultural shift for us in Australia. This is a quote from Leslie Newbigin. Now, Leslie, for those who don't know, amazing theologian in the 20th century. He worked as a missionary in India for a long time, did amazing work over there, came back to the UK, saw the huge cultural shift that had happened. Now, this would have been probably 20 or 30 years ago, so I'd already started to see the shift in the society towards the changing understanding of Christianity and the decline in people connecting with the church, and began teaching and writing a lot of stuff about it. Is credited as one of the people who helped found the idea of missional church and missional movement in Christianity. So he says, so he was talking about this change in society, and that the result's not, as we once imagined, a secular society. It is a paganist society, and it is paganism, having been born out of the rejection of Christianity, is far more resistant to the gospel than the pre-Christian paganism with which cross-cultural missions have been familiar. Here surely is the most challenging missionary frontier of our time. So what we're moving into an era now that's a new one for the church in the Western world. So we're not, we were the majority. We've had Christendom for 1700 years dominate our society. We're now moving out of that to a time where we're a post-Christian era. So it's not a new field where we haven't had Christianity there before, which is what would have been experienced as they spread the gospel. We've moved into this post-Christian era. So it's a different era. It's new. We haven't ever experienced this understanding of culture and society before. So it's no wonder we're all sitting here going, what is this? How do we deal with this? Because we haven't had to before as a church. What we need to think about, though, is that all our current church models, our practices, our understandings of how to connect with culture and society are all based on Christendom, peak Christendom era. Yep. So our denominations were born out when Christendom was the dominant religion in our societies. So what worked before may not work now because we're in a whole different era to when those things were created and set in place. Okay, so it's not all doom and gloom. There's been a fair bit of research done recently into people's attitudes towards spirituality rather than religion, and they paint a bit of a different picture. So let's have a look at a couple of those. So the National Church Life Survey did a different kind of research. It was a much smaller group, so I want you to understand that the pool from which this information is being pulled is not the size of the census. It was a couple of thousand people. So we've got to be really careful with data. That can be very skewed because it's a smaller group. But it still can give us a little bit of an idea of what's happening in this area. They show that while there's a trend for people to choose no religion, they're not hostile or closed off to the idea of a spiritual life. Yep. So people, particularly young Australians, are not wanting to identify with a religion, but they're much more open to the idea of spirituality and even Christian faith. As you can see in the statistics there, they're not comfortable with the institutional church, but 88% had a positive attitude toward Christians. Okay. So it shows there's a difference in attitude towards church and religion as an institution to that towards individual Christians they may know personally. Cool. The other really interesting article that I read recently about this is Deakin University did some research into the worldviews of Generation Z. Now, Generation Z is that 10 to 19 age bracket. And they asked their questions very differently. So rather than asking them about whether they identify as a type of denomination Christian, so Catholic or Protestant or Muslim or Hindu, any kind of religion, when they asked the questions in a different kind of language. So they asked things like, are you this world, or are you, sorry, let me try and find the different combinations. This world, indifferent, spiritual but not religious, seekers, nominally religious, or religiously committed. Now, if you combine all of those ones that are got some sort of connection with spirituality in them, you get to almost 63% of those teens identifying as having some kind of spiritual or religious connection. They were generally, again, it matches the National Church Life Survey information, 85% had a positive attitude towards Christians, 80% toward Buddhists, 75% towards Hindu, 74% towards Muslims. So they have quite a positive attitude towards the idea of a faith and people having spirituality. So what they, when you read through the data, their concerns are really about institution and the idea of intolerance and aggression shown towards others by the church as an institution. They're very much motivated by creating a peaceful, coexisting world, and they want people who care about other people and care about the world. So, and as it says, for the most part, they don't believe or belong in the same ways as members of older generations, and the majority of them don't see themselves as belonging to a religious tradition or organisation. So, I think we've gone through all of that. So, like with all the data that we've been looking at, this religious life of the Gen Z, the young people coming through, it's going to require a complete change in how we approach them. Because those traditional structures and understandings of religion as a institution, they are really confronting for them and uncomfortable. But the idea of spirituality and conversations about faith, particularly around care for others, is somewhere where they're really strong. All right, so Michael Frost says about this, we are facing an upcoming generation that is not closed off to faith, but far more critical of religious structures and traditions and the unique circumstance of a post-Christian society. This is new territory for the church, and as such, we need a new approach to reaching the current and future generations. All right, what does this mean for the church in Australia today? Let's just have it, we won't break up into groups. Has anyone got anything they want to feedback after that data that we've gone through?
We have to do things different.
We have to do things different?
Yeah, I think you highlighted that really, really clearly, that everything that we are doing currently now has been created from a world where Christianity was the dominant force. We are losing people in this moment, so we have to look at the growth, which areas are growing in our Christian faith. Why is that growing? How do we reach millennials? We have to do things differently. We've lost a generation, like Josh said earlier. So I think the data can only lead to one conclusion. So what does that mean? We need to start thinking outside of the box.
I think we used to see a lot of Christian people come to the church.
Yep.
And then we would love them and bless them and serve them. But we've noticed we have to put so much more effort and time and focus into going out of our building and,
absolutely,
and reaching our community with what they're doing and blessing them there, and then hopefully they might come on a Sunday, but that's now not the biggest point in the meeting place.
Yeah, and that's as we move, as we said, we move into people who have no religion and have no experience of that. They don't even know what church is. They don't know what happens there. They don't know what things we offer to support the community. So why would they even think to come to us? Yeah. Yeah, particularly when in the media, and I'm not saying the media's unbiased in any way, but particularly what we see in the media and what they see of religious institutions that are being reported is that one of what they would see as intolerance and aggression, and then damage, people being abused, and a lack of response, I guess, is what they would see. I'm not saying that's true or correct, but that's certainly what they're seeing from a societal point of view. Yep. Cool. All right. So some recent research with some church leaders, again, just reflects this idea. They're all saying that the church in Australia needs to shift. We've got a shift in culture. We need to shift to match it. It doesn't mean that we change on our values and our purpose. We're going to look at this a little more, but we need to change our expression. I think too, what has been highlighted by those leaders is this idea of discipleship and the church being the spread of the responsibility of sharing our faith needs to be on everyone within the church, rather than the model that we've kind of fallen into, where that can sometimes be seen as the job of the pastor or the evangelist or the outreach team within your church context. So they also, one of the other things that was highlighted was this idea that sorry, I'm just trying to look for the language they use, which is really good. We convert to disciple, so that idea that we have to convert someone and then disciple them, rather than what Jesus' model is, which is discipleship to help to move towards conversion. So we're going to have a little look at that idea. So what does Jesus say in the Bible? Let's go back to the source of why it is we call ourselves Christians, and have a look at Jesus and the early church. Jesus is the head of the church. So let's have a look at our head and see what he says about how he engaged in ministry and mission and growing his church while he was on earth. So look, we can pull lots out, but what we see when we look at Jesus and what he says, he speaks about coming to bring the kingdom of God to the people on the earth, and bringing God's favour. After Jesus went to the wilderness, so he came and started his ministry, got baptised, then went into the wilderness for 40 days, spent time, serious time in solitude and prayer with God. When he came out of that, the first thing he did was the first thing we know he did in Scripture was he went to the synagogue and he pulls out some Scripture to read, and it's this verse from Isaiah that kind of is basically an understanding of what it is he's come to do, is what he says. In that, he says that it's practical. It's about freeing people and bringing God's favour to the world. So I've come to set the slave free, make the blind see, and then to bring the year of the favour of the Lord. So that's when you go and then see what Jesus does and what he says, it reflects that. Jesus goes around sharing his message, showing that the kingdom of God is near, healing people physically, spiritually, and then this is the same thing that he tells his disciples to do. He sends them out, telling them to stay with one family when he goes to the town. When he sends out the disciples, stay with them, eat with them, get to know them, tell them about the kingdom, that it's near, heal the sick. Yep, all the same messages. Yep, and as Jesus is doing this happens fairly on in the discipleship's ministry. It's not like the discipleships had the 3 years with him to really grow their understanding and theology. He sends them out quite early on in their discipleship. Discipleship translates most effectively, when we translate it out, into the word apprenticeship. It's that idea of learning while doing. Yeah. When Jesus was preparing to leave, he spends lots of time telling people to love one another as he's loved us. that he's given us an example, we need to follow it. Then the Great Commission, go make disciples of all people. And I really think it's interesting to note that he says, go make disciples, then teach the disciples to obey. It's that idea of learning on the job. Again, that discipleship is about us growing together. It's about a journey. It's not about having to get to a point before you can then tell someone else the message. Yep. Again, Jesus just keeps demonstrating. He combines almost always combines his message of his messages with healings. When you see him talk to large crowds, it almost always says Jesus taught and healed. He matched his style of message to his context and audience. So when Jesus speaks with the Pharisees, it's a very different type of language and a very different kind of conversation to when he talks to large crowds. Again, it's a different type of conversation as to when he talks to disciples. You can see that when in John 3, when he talks to Nicodemus, the language and the style of the conversation is very complex and digs deeply into the idea of understanding Scripture in the context of who Jesus is. When he speaks to large masses, it's predominantly in parables, and that idea of trying to find ways for people to connect their experiences in life as peasants and living day to day with the messages that Jesus is trying to portray and to help them to understand. Again, it's different when he goes into the synagogue. Jesus would go to the synagogue regularly and read Scripture and then debate and discuss the Scripture and how it applied to him. Again, different to when he talked to the disciples. So he would often explain the parables to them. He would often rebuke them, but in a different way to the Pharisees. It was much more that you're not getting it, I'm a bit frustrated. Let me help you to try and understand this, or to pull them up when they were getting maybe going down the wrong path. So it's really important to look back on Scripture and look at Jesus. What does he say when he's here? What does he do when he's here? Even thinking about Jesus and why did he start his ministry at 30? What was it that meant that he chose to wait to 30? Is it so that he could get some of that culture and context experience? Was it because rabbis, you had to be a certain age to be a rabbi, and seen as a rabbi and a teacher of people? He was understanding his culture and his context and matching the way he chose to do his ministry to that. Anyone want to jump in here before I move on? Cool. Sorry. Pushing through here. In Acts, again, when we look at the early church, we look at their values. It's this description of community of believers coming together, living together, sharing their resources, eating together, speaking to people about who Jesus was. In the beginning, the early followers of Christ, they worshipped and they met and they connected in with the synagogues and connected in with people through that. The early church changed while they were countercultural in the way that they lived, but they still, until the fall of Jerusalem, they still worshipped and met and connected in with their Jewish culture and context. Again, that was different to churches that were set up in a Gentile area, and that's where there was a little bit of debate and working out between the early church. They certainly didn't get it all right, but it was the idea of a social gospel. It was about living it out, not as a strategy, but because that's what Jesus had demonstrated and taught them, was to live out their faith in their whole lives and the way that they lived, and to help people to understand who they were through that. And that was what was countercultural, was their idea of living together, slave and free, rich and poor, women being valued and made apostles and part of the church community. Yeah, so like I said, there were certainly problems and weaknesses. They weren't the perfect example. None of us are going to be, because we're living in a world where we haven't seen the fullness of the kingdom of God come. But I think it's important to look back at those people who were the closest to Jesus and his ministry and his work to give us an example of how to live that out in our day-to-day lives when we're trying to establish ourselves as a church and a community as well as an individual follower of Jesus. Okay. Using all this information, what do we see as the mission of the church? What's our role? Jesus came, he calls him Christ the head of the church. He gave us this idea of a community. What is it? What's our role? What's our mission as a church? Let's have a look at this quote from David Bosch. Sorry, I love quotes, so you're going to get them sprinkled through here. People say things far better than I can. They're much more succinct. I use 50 words when 5 would do. So, but David Bosch did an amazing amount of theological research into the idea of mission and what the church and mission is all about. His big main book on it is a solid read, but it is phenomenal if you're interested in this idea of what is God's mission and what is our mission as the church and as followers of Christ, with extensive research and knowledge. So he says when he goes and looks through all the Gospels and the early church and then mission throughout Christendom, and then comes back and kind of summarises it all. And so he says mission is understood as being derived from the very nature of God. The doctrine of the Missio Dei as God the Father sending the Son and God the Father and the Son sending Spirit is expanded to include yet another movement, Father, Son and Holy Spirit sending the church into the world. Mission is quite simply the participation of Christians in the liberating mission of Jesus. It is the good news of God's love incarnated in the witness of a community for the sake of the world. Yeah, I love it. It sums up for me what church is about. It's about us coming together, building each other up to then express that into the world. Yeah. Mission activity is not so much the work of the church as simply the church at work. More than ever, we have a culture that's less and less connected with the understanding of what Christian faith even is. And we need to view our role in the church and Christian communities as missional, as our mission. Yep. We need to start thinking about that idea, particularly as we become a minority. It's in a post-Christian world, so as we said earlier, it's a different understanding of the culture, and it's something we need to wrap our head around. But often I like to think of it as me being a missionary in my culture and context that I am placed in by God. Yep, we're heading into a culture and a context and a community that we don't know, that we haven't understood before as a church. And so missionaries these days, often, when they get sent out, the first year is just living in the culture, in the context, learning the language, getting to understand the people in the community, building relationships. And that's all work. There's no actual ministry established necessarily within that year. It's about coming to understand where they live, the people that they're living with, and how they're going to need to match what they do with the culture that they're in. And I think as we move into a church, into a post-Christian era, this is what we need to be doing in our churches. We need to be taking our time to go into our areas as missionaries, to live in there, to develop relationships with those around us, to understand the demographics, to know the culture and the context of our space, as well as the wider society of the country that we're in. All right. Do you know what your local culture and context is in where your ministry is or where you're living? Sometimes they're two different places. Do you know what your culture and context is where you live? Do you know the demographics of your area? Do you know the neighbours down your street? How many have got kids? How many haven't? How many are from a different cultural background? How many, what's their socioeconomic situation? What about in your local community? What's the demographics there? What's your socioeconomic breakdown? How many people are living in government housing? What's your multiculturalism? Do you know the culture and context that you're in? You might be living in your ministry context, you might not be, and that might be a completely different field. So if you're living in a different suburb or location to where your church or your ministry runs, what's that community? What's that culture and context? Have you spent time getting to know the people in your area? Does anyone have any ideas? How do you get to know the culture and context that you're in?
Being in community would be a start, but is there a way to find data statistics for your local community?
Yes, there is. Being in a community, though, maybe expand that out for me. What does that mean?
Shop local, chat with your coffee shop lady and find out where she lives. Go to the local park and not the park that's in the neighbourhood across the road because it looks better than the one that you've got. Don't just sit in your church building. When you're at sports community, I'm a shocker for this. I drop my kids off at sport and I sit quite quietly and just watch them all by myself because I'm tired. I want to talk to people. But maybe engaging with those people and finding out where they're from.
Yeah, cool. Any other ideas?
I have a question. If there's, oh, so I don't want to be hogging the. We'll go to the.
Okay, Kaz, were you going to say something?
Yeah. Just go for a walk in the neighbourhood and pat every dog, get gardening advice from every neighbour, and be willing to listen.
Yep.
And the more you listen and hear what everyone has a story, the more you hear and collect stories, the more you can gauge what's going on, and you can understand them a bit better.
Yeah. Thanks, Kaz. I love the idea that listening, that's really important. It's about, it's about us taking in what the people around us are sharing with us. Yep. It's not about us sharing who we are yet. Yep. Thanks. Sorry, Josh, you were going to say?
Well, I've been thinking about, said it before, that understanding the context and culture, if that should shape how we do things or what we do. Looking at the local statistics for Monty, I sense that there's probably some people that are in need that aren't in the statistics.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know how to shape what we do, because I feel like what we've been doing for the last 70 years is being shaped towards the majority of the people in our statistics, which are white, well-off families.
Yep.
And unfortunately, we haven't been that successful in bringing people to faith in, but there might be 1% of people that are like homeless or sleeping rough or that aren't having food 2 or 3 times a day, and they're not in the statistics, but maybe they're the people we should be trying to reach out to and find them and love them and care for them.
Yep. So how would you find out that?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm asking.
Anyone else? Before I jump in?
I guess my question would be, would there be a place to actually like talk to community leaders and things, so that the local council members and...
Absolutely. Yep. Talk to your local council. Find out where there will be community groups or government-run groups that do food bank stuff for people in your community. There will be. It's about finding them. Yep. And talking to them, understanding that their perspective is going to be largely skewed into the area that they're meeting, but there will be that information. Local. I can't push strongly enough the idea of developing a relationship with your local council. Yep. They are going to have more data than you ever will on the demographics and the people in need in your area. They're also going to have, they're going to want to work, if you develop relationships, they're going to want to work with you to try and meet those needs, because their demand on their time and their resources is huge. They're never going to have the people or the resources to do that. Take time to develop that relationship, find out what the needs are from their perspective, and see how you can align with what they're doing. Yeah. One of the other things that was suggested to me and that I love and I suggest to lots of other people is go and sit in a local cafe for an hour, have your lunch break in there, or just have a coffee in the morning, have a break, and just watch who comes in and out. Try a different cafe in different areas, see the different demographics of people that walk in and out. Try not to eavesdrop, but see that idea of what's happening in terms of conversations. Who's sitting together and chatting? Are they coming in and grabbing coffee and running out again? Are people stopping to talk? What's the demographic of people who are there? Is it a lot of workers who are taking a break and grabbing a coffee? Or is it a lot of mums who are sitting there and having a break with kids running around? Is it lots of older people, an older generation, where there's lots of older people who are taking the time to have a break? Can understand your culture and the area that you're in by moving around it and spending time in it, and listening and attentively taking in what's happening, with yourself open to the Spirit. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. So it shouldn't be the only place you go. Absolutely. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, but you'll still see a broad perspective of the people coming into your area. And you might be in an area, if I don't know where you guys live, you might be in an area where you've got a huge amount, such as the city, where you've got a huge amount of people moving in and out for work. So how you minister to those people and connect with those people is going to be very different to out in my local Bacchus Marsh community, where basically everyone who comes through the cafe lives there, their kids go to school there, they've probably got a... that either, if they're having a coffee in the cafe, they don't commute for work, they work from there. So that's what I mean. It's about understanding it's understanding where you're placed, where God's placed you, and what those people are. Go for a walk through the streets, as Kaz says. Bump into people, talk to them, get to know your local council. If you're wanting numbers, there's a great website called Profile ID. It breaks all the details down per suburb. You can even go by postcode. All your local councils use that for all their data. The other thing that is interesting about that website is it gives you projections on what's going to happen in your area. So all these crazy people who look at all these numbers and then are able to, and look, they don't get it perfect, but they use all that information and what's happened historically to be able to project out where your area is going to go in terms of growth and different demographics for the next 10 or 20 years. So you can get that idea of what's happening. Our local community, they predicted we were going to grow by 50% in about 10 years, and we're almost there. So when we moved into Bacchus Marsh 12 years ago, it was about half the size that it is now. And when we moved in 12 years ago, that was about double the size that it had been 10 years before that. So we're in a huge growth area. Yep. That's not the same for other areas. Some areas are declining. So, and it's about understanding who's moving in. How do we translate this information into our church and ministry context? Gone out, we've got all the data, we've done what we've done, we've learnt what the demographics is in our area. We know all this data from the stats that we've looked at, the census information. We understand that our culture and context is changing. As you said, Josh, you've been doing the same thing for 70 years. Your demographic may not have changed, but what you're doing clearly isn't working. So what is it? What's that disconnect that's happening between your culture and context? Yeah. So how do we translate all that stuff we're learning into what we're doing in our church? I'm going to get you to break up into your groups. Just have a little chat about this. This is the core. This is what it's all about. What do we do with all this stuff that we now know? How do we let it change and reflect in how we do our ministry? Yep. What's the core of what you're trying to do? We talked about that with the church. What's the mission of the church? What does that mean for what we're doing in our churches or our ministry contexts? Does what we know as the core match with what we're doing in terms of our practices and our structures? So 10 minutes, please, Andy. Let's try and chat about that, and then we'll come back and feedback and try and wrap things up. All right, I'm not going to force you to share this time. If people want to jump in and share anything, any insights that came up in their groups, please do.
We kind of somehow or other got onto sort of religiosity versus spirituality, and it's like, what about the religiosity turns people off? Had a good discussion around that.
Yep.
Yeah.
What did you come up with?
What did we come up with, guys?
Nice. I like that segue into jobbing someone in.
Gotcha.
Prayer and fasting.
Prayer and fasting. For you?
Yourself to the religiosity inside the soul.
So, sorry, unpack that for me, Jacob.
There's religion everywhere. We talked about scripture that says the only religion that God accepts is helping the orphans and widows in their distress, not being poisoned by the world. But the Pharisees, which is kind of like the depiction of religiosity in Jesus' time, could have been considered quite poisonous and still today. And so, yeah, you get rid of the religiosity in yourself, and you can see clearly in where it is, and you can actually say you can be a part of the traditional churches and religion without actually being affected by it. And so, yeah, get rid of the religiosity in you start to get rid of the hypocrisy, and the hypocrisy is one of the biggest things that has deterred people from the traditional church. I would say the preachers want to act a different way, but yeah.
Yep. That's really good. Guess the key part of that's that discipleship, idea of discipleship. When we take on discipleship ourselves, and that accountability and that need to grow and learn as we do, we're automatically going to be challenging that idea of the religiosity, the structure, and the falling back into the comfortable traditions rather than challenging and continuing to grow ourselves in our faith. Yep. Anyone else? Go.
So I was just exploring in our context. We've got a bunch of skateboarders that like to hang out on our car park.
Yep.
And we've got lots of people who like to use our little playground. And we're wanting to, set up a basketball ring and just make it a space for people to come and be from the neighbourhood.
Yep.
And I think, it was interesting to think about maybe turning the church inside out a little bit, making it a place to want to be around, even just opportunity as our youth grows to start thinking about schools ministry. What does it look like to go inside out from the institution and start to get into the community, like the send from institution, and then maybe making institution not seem as intimidating, or just a place that's just a part of the neighbourhood that anyone is free to come and be around, be in, or just a safe place for maybe like dispersing some of that unapproachability of the building that people might feel. If like those young people that kind of feel like the institution is not something that they feel positively about.
Yep, absolutely. That's great. It's really exciting, I think, Tom, that you're thinking that way. And looking what's already happening in your area and trying to match what you're doing with that. You've got people coming on your site. I mean, there'd be churches that would love that to be happening. It's about then how do we create a community and a relationship and a way to support them so that we can develop relationships. That's fantastic. It reminds me there's a church in Tassie that really looked at their community and what was in need in the community and built their building around that idea. So they built an indoor play centre into their community because there wasn't one in the area. They then put a cafe with it so that they could connect with the families that were coming in to use the indoor play centre. Their building it can divide into 5 million different ways, so they can hold all kinds of different functions there. So they might host businesses during the week who use it as a conference space. They do lots of weddings there because they sit in a nice picturesque place, and that's another place to connect, to develop relationship, to offer premarital counselling. What they've done is they've looked at what their space is, what they have, and how that can service the community around them. So that they can have what they say, have people in orbit around them and helping them to become, I guess, familiar and understand what it is that Christianity is, what it is this church does, how it is that, what it is to have a relationship with God, and how they can express that love of God in every way that they use their facilities as well as themselves. It's definitely not about one model working for everyone. It's about finding what the needs are in your community and adapting your model or your approach to meet that. Yep. It's about that idea of holding tightly to our core values, to our purpose, to our mission as our church, and holding really loosely to the structures and the programs and the day-to-day practices that we use to try and, build each other up and reach out into the community. We really need to also challenge how we assess our measurables. What are we measuring? Are we measuring the amount of people who walk into our doors, or are we measuring the growth in them? Are we measuring their connection through the week with others? Are we looking at how many people feel confident to disciple or to share their faith? What are our measurables? Because what we measure affects what we see as success. Yep. And that then structures what we do. So if we're measuring numbers, only numbers, what does that reflect in who we are or what we value? Almost at the end of time, but I just thought I'd share a little bit about our journey. We certainly haven't got it all right. We're very small, but we set out when we set up our church plant in Bacchus Marsh to meet the needs of the people in our community. We spent time living there, getting to know people. We looked at the demographics. We have a huge population of young families in our area that continues to grow because we have what's seen as affordable housing in our area. You can get a slightly larger block for a little bit less because it's further out of town. Yep. But also lots and lots of families in our area have a parent, at least one, sometimes two, that are commuting for work, often 6 days a week to try and catch up and get ahead in mortgage payments. And so we had to think about how do we do church to meet those people? And we have a demographic. We have lots of lovely, beautiful traditional churches in our area. And and they meet a need for some of the people in our area, because our next biggest demographic is people who are retired and in aged care. We kind of have a what do you call that, roller coaster. But their needs are strongly getting met by the other churches and ministries in our area. Our ministers meet once a month. We have a really good ecumenical conversation, and they are working in the aged care homes. They are running services and visiting homes and meeting those needs. So we went, where are we needed? And we're needed in that young families area. And we stopped and we went, okay, but that's the area where people have no experience, or very limited experience of Christian faith. I learned that through going to the play groups and getting to know the mums and having conversations, and them asking me, because we met in the Uniting Church Hall for our play group, they're like, I don't even know what that means. Does that mean they're Christian, or are they something else? And so it's these conversations you have that help you to understand that people have no concept of faith. So we targeted what we did to meet the needs of those people around us. And we keep doing that. We hold really loosely to our structure. Every year we have a look and see if what we're doing is working to meet the needs of the people. We've had families come along, over probably 50% of the people who come to our service and have over the time have no experience of Christian faith. We meet on a Sunday afternoon. We run things that are all combined together because our kids actually outnumber our adults. So I can't run a service that doesn't include the kids because they're the largest part of our congregation. We eat together at the end because we know that they've got young kids. It's 6:30 on a Sunday evening. That way they can get home, they can put the kids to bed. It's about trying to structure what we do to meet the needs of the people around us, so it's as comfortable as possible for them to come in and build relationship and to connect with us. That's just what we do on a Sunday. The rest of the week we're spending time in a community. I work as a chaplain in the school. My husband and I are both involved in community groups. It's about spending our days developing those relationships, building our connections into the community to be able to share God's love through what we do and through what we say. So I guess I challenge you, don't go away from this with all that data and not use it to form some of your thoughts and how you challenge what your structures and your practices are, because it's about understanding a context and then applying what we do to match that. I'm going to leave you because I know it's late. I'm sorry, I'm 1 minute over. But I'm going to leave you with this quote, but I'm going to leave you with a final blessing. I like to finish with that. This is a Michael Lunig little prayer that I'm going to share with you. God, help us to change ourselves and to change our world, to know the need for it, to deal with the pain of it, to feel the joy of it, to undertake the journey without understanding the destination, the art of gentle revolution.